The alarm had already been tripped when Combe Brannick reached the third corridor. He knew because the floor changed temperature. The polished selenite tiles beneath his boots went from body warm to ice cold in 2 steps, which meant the Velori Archive's security grid had detected mass that should not have been there, and was now channeling thermal energy away from the breach zone to power the lockdown sequence. Combe had studied the building's specifications for 11 months. He had memorized the thermal shift tables, mapped the response intervals, committed the guard rotation schedules to a memory so disciplined it could replay architectural schematics while his hands picked locks. None of that preparation had accounted for the fact that the Velori had upgraded their grid 16 days ago. 16 days. He had been in transit for 20. Thermals dropped, said Wren through the bone conduction patch behind his left ear. Wren's voice was calm, the practiced calm of a woman who had run extraction logistics for 9 years and had learned that panic was a budget you spent once. You have about 90 seconds before the interior partitions seal. I know what the thermals mean. Then move faster. Combe moved faster. The corridor was a marvel of Velori architectural excess, 7 meters wide and 4 stories tall, its walls lined with display alcoves recessed at precise intervals, each alcove lit by a focused beam of cold blue light that fell from concealed apertures in the vaulted ceiling. The Velori did not build museums the way humans did. They built reliquaries. Every object in this corridor was sealed behind a containment membrane calibrated to the artifact's molecular signature, and every membrane was monitored by an independent sensor cluster, reporting to a central oversight intelligence the Velori called the Conservator. The Conservator was not an AI in the human sense. It was a distributed cognition woven through the building's structural lattice, a mind made of architecture, and it was very, very good at noticing when things that did not belong were walking through its body. Combe counted alcoves as he ran. 14, 15, 16. Each one held a relic stripped from a different world, acquired through the Velori's centuries-old practice of cultural salvage, the polite term for raiding dead and dying civilizations and cataloging their remains with exquisite scholarly precision. The Velori were not conquerors. They were curators. They waited for species to collapse, then swept in with preservation teams and meticulous documentation protocols, and they took everything worth keeping. What made it complicated was that they genuinely believed they were performing a service. Their archives held the last surviving examples of art, language, technology, and sacred objects from over 400 extinct or near-extinct civilizations. In many cases, the Velori copies were the only copies left. In one particular case, the civilization they had salvaged was not extinct, not even close. 23, 24. Combe's boots hit the selenite in a rhythm he forced himself not to rush. Speed attracted attention. Controlled movement looked like authorized movement, and on the security feeds his forged credentials still showed him as Dr. Kalen Marsh, visiting xenoarchaeological attaché from the Concord's cultural exchange program. The credentials would hold for another 12 minutes. The thermal alert would bring inspectors, but inspectors followed procedure, and procedure on Valar Prime began with an automated diagnostic sweep of all sensor nodes before dispatching personnel. The sweep took 6 minutes. Combe had calculated that margin 11 months ago, sitting at a desk in a rented room on Brevari Station, staring at schematics Patel had smuggled out of a Velori trade school database. 6 minutes had felt generous then. It felt less generous now. Alcove 31. Combe stopped. The display was modest by Velori standards, a single object on a low pedestal of white stone, the containment membrane casting a faint shimmer around it like heat haze over summer asphalt. The object was a sphere, roughly the size of a grapefruit, dark iron gray, with a surface texture that looked like hammered metal, but was not metal at all. It was ceramic, a compound that human materials scientists had not been able to replicate in 300 years of trying, fired at temperatures that exceeded what modern kilns could achieve by a factor that made engineers uncomfortable. Its surface was covered in inscriptions so fine they were invisible to the naked eye, but Combe did not need to see them. He had memorized every line from the holographic scans his grandmother had shown him when he was 12 years old, sitting on her kitchen floor in a house outside Galway, while rain hammered the windows, and she explained, with the quiet ferocity of someone who had spent 40 years failing to be heard, what the Velori had taken from Earth. The cartographer's sphere, found in 2089 in a sealed chamber beneath the foundations of a structure in central Turkey that predated every known human civilization by at least 8,000 years, catalogued, studied for 11 years by a joint team from 6 universities, scanned and spectrographed and debated in 14 published papers, and then taken, not seized, not demanded. The Velori had simply arrived at the research facility one morning, with a cultural preservation order signed by the Concord's Heritage Arbitration Board, a body on which the Velori held 4 of 7 seats, and they had walked out with the sphere and 14 other artifacts in padded transit cases, leaving behind a receipt and a licensing agreement that granted Earth scholars remote holographic access on a schedule the Velori controlled. Combe's grandmother had been the lead researcher on the project. She had watched them carry it out. She had filed appeals for 23 years. She had died with the latest appeal still pending, her notes stacked in boxes in the house outside Galway, her life's work reduced to holographic scans of an object she was no longer permitted to touch. He was going to touch it now. 60 seconds, Wren said. Combe pulled the bypass module from his vest pocket. It was the size of a deck of cards, built by a human engineer named Patel, who had spent 6 years reverse engineering Velori containment membrane protocols by studying the ones Earth had been permitted to purchase for its own museum systems. Patel had not asked what the module was for. She had handed it over with a look that said she knew exactly what it was for, and that her only regret was not being the one to use it. He pressed the module against the containment membrane. The membrane resisted for 2 seconds, its shimmer intensifying, and Combe felt a static charge build across his knuckles. Then the shimmer wavered, destabilized, and collapsed inward like a soap bubble folding into itself. The air in the alcove changed immediately. Cold archive atmosphere replaced by something warmer, something that carried a faint mineral scent Combe recognized from dig sites, the smell of fired earth and deep time. "Membrane down," he said. I saw timers running, 42 seconds to partition seal. Combe reached into the alcove. His fingers closed around the sphere. Weight hit his palm first, more than he expected, dense and solid in a way that felt deliberate, as if the object had been designed to resist being carried casually. The surface was warm, not from the archive's climate control. From something inside, a faint radiative heat that pulsed against his skin with a rhythm he could not immediately identify. He lifted it from the pedestal, and the pedestal's contact sensors registered the absence and sent a secondary alert to the conservator. He had expected that. What he had not expected was what happened next. The inscriptions lit up. Not all at once. A single line first, spiraling from the sphere's equator toward its north pole, thin as spider silk and bright as a struck match, the color of old gold. The line traced a path that Combe's trained eye recognized instantly as a stellar trajectory, a route plotted through real space using coordinate markers that matched no known navigation system, but followed a logic his grandmother had spent decades trying to decode. A second line followed, then a third, and within 5 heartbeats the sphere's entire surface was alive with golden thread light, hundreds of roots spreading across its surface like a nervous system waking from anesthesia. The sphere had been inert for 300 years. Every scan, every holographic imaging session, every remote analysis the Velori had conducted showed the same thing, a dense ceramic object with surface inscriptions that did not respond to any form of energy input. The Valori had classified it as a decorative cartographic model, an ancient human attempt to represent stellar positions in physical form. Beautiful, inert, dead. It was not dead, it had been waiting. Calm, Ren's voice had changed. Not louder but tighter, the way a cable sounds when load shifts onto it. The conservator just reclassified your corridor. You're no longer an intruder. You're listed as an active energy source. That changes the response protocol from containment to hazard assessment. You need to leave. Now. One moment. You do not have a moment. He knew she was right. He had the sphere. That was the mission. Patel's bypass module, Ren's logistics, 9 months of planning, 3 months positioning himself as a visiting researcher at the Concord Xenoarchaeological Conference on Valor Prime, all of it aimed at this single act. Get the sphere out of the archive, off the planet, and back to Earth where it belonged. He should have been running. Instead, he stood perfectly still, because the sphere was doing something he had not expected and could not walk away from. The golden roots on its surface were rearranging. The stellar trajectories were shifting, converging, and as Combe watched, every line on the sphere began to orient itself toward a single point. Hundreds of roots, thousands of coordinate markers, all of them curving inward like compass needles finding north, and the point they converged on was pulsing with a brightness that made the rest of the golden light look dim. The convergence point was directly beneath his right thumb. The sphere knew where it was. More than that, the sphere knew who was holding it. A sound filled the alcove. Not an alarm, not a mechanical response, but a tone, a single sustained note that resonated in the bones of Combs' hands and climbed through his wrists and forearms into his chest. The note was complex, layered with harmonics that shifted as the golden roots completed their convergence. And when the last line locked into place, the tone resolved into something that was not quite sound and not quite language, but occupied the space between them where meaning lived without words. Then the sphere spoke. Not in sound, in knowledge. The way you remember a name you had forgotten, the information arriving complete and whole without the effort of retrieval. Navigator of the first roads. Combs' hand tightened. His vision blurred and cleared. For a fraction of a second, he was not standing in a Valori archive corridor on a world 17 transits from Earth. He was standing at a crossroads that existed before the word crossroads had been invented, and the roads that spread out from where he stood were not roads of stone or dirt, but of light, threads of gold stretching between stars that had no names yet. And he understood with a certainty that Bypass thought entirely that his species had once walked those roads. Humans had walked them. Not as passengers, as builders, as the ones who laid the first roots between stars when the Valori were still learning to chip flint, and the Brevari had not yet descended from their canopy forests, and the Concord was an impossibility that would not exist for another 30,000 years. The vision lasted less than a second. When it ended, Combe was back in the corridor, the sphere pulsing gold in his hand, and the archive was waking up around him. Containment membranes in adjacent alcoves were flickering, their shimmer cycling from blue to amber and back. The cold blue display lights in alcoves 29 and 30 were shifting to warm gold. Down the corridor, Combe could see the waves spreading, alcove after alcove changing color in a cascade that moved away from him in both directions. The selenite floor beneath his boots had gone from cold back to warm, but the warmth was different from the archive's default temperature. It was radiating from the sphere, spreading outward in concentric waves that the building's structural lattice was absorbing and amplifying, because the conservator was not just a security system. It was built from the same material science as the sphere. The same technology. The same people had made both, separated by 30,000 years but speaking the same language at the molecular level, and the sphere was addressing the building in that language, and the building was answering. The partitions are not sealing, Ren said. Her voice carried the careful modulation of someone watching instruments display readings that contradicted each other. Combe, the lockdown is not engaging. The conservator has reclassified the entire wing. Your corridor is now listed as, and I am reading this directly from the external feed, authorized access, Navigator class priority. I have no idea what that means. The Valori security protocols don't have a Navigator class. I know what it means. Then tell me while you run. Because the diagnostic sweep just completed 4 minutes ahead of schedule, and they are dispatching personnel. Combe ran, but not toward the route he had planned. The original extraction called for a sprint back through the 3 corridors he had entered by, then a controlled descent through a maintenance shaft to sublevel 4 where Wren had parked the shuttle in a service bay. Clean route, practiced route, a route that assumed the building would be trying to stop him. The building was not trying to stop him. The building was opening doors. Ahead of him, at the end of the corridor, a partition that should have been sealed was sliding apart with the smooth deliberation of a mechanism that had been waiting a very long time to perform this exact function. Beyond it, another corridor opened, one Combe had never seen in any schematic, narrower than the public galleries, its walls unfinished stone without display alcoves, a service passage or something older, something that predated the Valori's renovation of this structure by millennia. The sphere pulsed in his hand. The golden roots shifted, and one line brightened, a single thread of light that pointed straight down the opening corridor like an arrow drawn in fire. Combe had been trained, since he was 12 years old, to follow the evidence. To trust the data even when the data made no sense, especially when the data made no sense, because the gap between expectation and observation was where discovery lived. His grandmother had taught him that. She had taught him on a kitchen floor in Galway with holographic projections, and cold tea and 23 years of unanswered appeals stacked in the next room. He followed the arrow. Behind him, something shifted in the corridor he had left. The sound reached him faintly through the narrowing passage, a mechanical grinding followed by the hiss of atmosphere redistributing, the building closing the partition he had entered through, sealing the route behind him as cleanly as if it had never existed. The sphere's golden arrow pulsed once, a brief brightening that Combe read as confirmation. Forward, it said, not back. Forward is the only direction that matters now. The passage descended, not steeply but steadily, a gentle grade that took him below the archive's public levels into a stratum the schematics had not included. The walls changed as he went deeper. The unfinished stone gave way to material he recognized from the sphere itself, the same iron-gray ceramic, smooth and faintly warm to the touch, inscribed with lines so fine they looked like natural grain, until the sphere's light caught them and they flared into brief golden life as he passed. Each flare lasted only a second before fading, but the pattern was unmistakable. The walls were responding to the sphere the way nerve endings respond to a returning signal, lighting up in sequence, confirming connection. He was inside the original structure, not the Valori archive, whatever had been here before the Valori built on top of it. I've lost your position on the building schematic, Wren said. You're below the mapped levels. Whatever you're walking through doesn't exist in any plan I have. Combe, the shuttle is on sublevel 4. You are going the wrong direction. The sphere is guiding me. The sphere is an artifact you came to steal. It does not get to set the extraction route. It's not just an artifact, Wren. Not the way we thought, not the way anyone thought. Silence from Wren, 2 seconds, 3. Then, how far down does it go? I don't know yet. You have maybe 6 minutes before security reaches the wing. I can delay the shuttle departure, but I cannot delay it forever. Understood. The passage leveled and opened into a chamber. Not large, perhaps 10 meters across, roughly circular, with a ceiling so low Combe could have touched it by raising his hand. The floor was the same iron-gray ceramic, seamless, without joints or mortar lines, as if the entire room had been cast in a single pour of material that should not have been pourable. The walls were covered in inscriptions, and in the sphere's light they came alive, golden roots and coordinate markers spreading across every surface in a continuous map that wrapped the room like the inside of a globe. Colm stepped to the center of the room and turned slowly, and as he turned, the sphere's light intensified in response to his movement, golden roots flaring brighter wherever they intersected with his line of sight, as if the device was tracking his attention, feeding him data at the rate his eyes could process it. The technology behind that capability was staggering. A responsive display system embedded in ceramic walls, operational after 30,000 years of abandonment, still calibrated to human visual processing speed. He understood what he was standing inside. A navigation chart. Not a chart of known space, a chart of the roads. The first roads, the routes that predated every known method of interstellar transit, the theoretical pathways that human astrophysicists had proposed in the 2140s and conquered scientists had dismissed as mathematical curiosities, the ghost traces that appeared in certain gravitational lensing data and vanished when you tried to resolve them with conventional instruments. They were real, they were here, and they were covered in human inscriptions. In the center of the room, set into the floor with tolerances so tight a sheet of paper would not have fit the seam, was a depression shaped exactly like the sphere. A cradle, the sphere's home, the socket it had been designed to sit in, and the socket was waiting with the patient precision of something machined to purpose and left ready. Colm knelt. The sphere's pulse had slowed, deepening into something that felt less like urgency and more like recognition, the rhythm of a thing returning to its place. But he did not set the sphere down. Not yet. Because the inscriptions on the walls were still moving, still brightening, and as the sphere's light intensified, the golden lines began to extend beyond the walls, projecting into the air above Colm's head in a three-dimensional lattice of roots and nodes that filled the chamber with a stellar map so detailed, and so vast it made every navigation database in the Concord look like a child's drawing scratched in dirt. The lattice rotated slowly. Colm saw nodes he recognized, Sol burning steady amber, Alpha Centauri, the Brevari homeworld. Valor Prime itself, the node directly above him, pulsing with faint recognition. But these were not endpoints. They were waypoints, rest stops on roads that continued far beyond the boundaries of known space, roads reaching into regions no conquered ship had ever explored, regions that modern astrophysics said were unreachable because the energy costs of conventional transit made them prohibitive. Every one of those roads was marked with human coordinate notation, the same notation system Colm's grandmother had spent her career trying to reconstruct from fragments. The first roads had been built by humans. Not modern humans. Not the humans who had stumbled into the Concord 2 centuries ago with fusion drives and halting diplomatic protocols, treated as newcomers, as the youngest species at the galactic table, as clever but late arrivals to a civilization that had been running without them for millennia. These roads predated the Conquered by tens of thousands of years, predated the Velori, predated the Brevari, predated every species that currently claimed seniority in the galactic hierarchy. His grandmother had theorized this. She had seen it in the inscriptions on the sphere, in the coordinate systems that matched no known alien notation but bore structural similarities to archaic human mathematical traditions, in the ceramic compound that used firing techniques consistent with ancient human metallurgical principles scaled to impossible temperatures. She had published 3 papers. She had been politely ignored by 2 academic journals and rejected outright by a 3rd. She had spent the last decade of her life in the house outside Galway, refining holographic scans of an object she could not touch, certain she was right and unable to prove it because the proof was locked in a display case 17 transits away, behind a containment membrane that would not exist for another 6 years because Patel had not yet started reverse engineering the protocols. He was holding the proof. The sphere pulsed once more, and the golden lattice above him shifted. One root brightened above all others, a thick golden line that ran from Sol outward in a direction Combs' mental star charts placed somewhere beyond the Orion spur, deep into territory marked on conquered charts as uncharted and assumed empty. The root pulsed with the same rhythm as the sphere, the same rhythm as Combs' heartbeat, and at its far end, a node burned brighter than any other, a destination the sphere was marking with unmistakable emphasis. Something was out there, something the road builders had left at the end of the longest road, something that was still waiting. Combs committed the lattice to memory. Every route, every node, every coordinate marker his eyes could hold. He worked systematically, the way his grandmother had taught him, dividing the projection into quadrants and encoding each one against landmarks he would remember, the training of a man who had spent his life memorizing things that other people considered impossible to retain. Margaret Brannock had drilled him for years. She had believed that one day someone in the family would get close enough to the real thing to need that skill, and she had been right, and she had not lived to see it. He stored the last quadrant. The lattice pulsed, and Combs felt a faint sense of acknowledgement from the sphere, as if it understood that he had taken what he needed and approved of the method. His grandmother had called this technique deep mapping, the ability to store spatial data in associative memory chains rather than sequential recall. She had drilled it into him over 6 years, using holographic projections of increasing complexity, testing his recall with randomized queries, building the capacity the way a mason builds a wall, one stone at a time, each one supporting the next. She had built this skill into him for this exact moment, and she had never known if the moment would come. Combs, Wren's voice cut through. Velori security is mobilizing. I'm reading 12 response units converging on the archive's eastern wing. They know the conservator has been overridden. The building's refusal to engage lockdown is generating priority alerts across 3 security networks. You have maybe 4 minutes before they reach the sublevels. Combs looked at the sphere cradle in the floor. He looked at the golden lattice filling the air above him. He looked at the route burning toward the unknown destination. The mission had been simple: get the sphere, get out, return it to Earth, let the universities study it, let his grandmother's legacy be vindicated. Simple. Nothing about what the sphere had shown him was simple. The mission had changed. The sphere was not a trophy to be repatriated. It was a key, and the lock it fit was bigger than anything he had prepared for. He stood. The sphere's light dimmed as he rose, the golden lattice fading from the air, the wall inscription settling back into stillness. The room was not finished with him. He could feel it, a faint reluctance in the ceramic underfoot, a warmth that lingered. But the room understood urgency. The room had been built by people who understood that knowledge sometimes had to be carried out under fire. He turned and ran back up the passage. The building continued to help him. Doors opened ahead of his footsteps. The ceramic walls glowed faintly to mark his path, each section lighting just long enough to guide him and dimming behind him. The conservators distributed intelligence, responding to the sphere's presence, with a cooperation that 3 centuries of Velori commands had never managed to elicit. The Velori had owned this building for 400 years. They had constructed their archive on top of it, integrated their technology into its lattice, programmed their conservator through its bones. And in all that time, the building had complied. It had performed its functions. It had protected its contents. It had accepted every modification and upgrade and renovation the Velori had imposed, but it had never done this. It had never opened a passage it had kept hidden. It had never projected a map it had kept dark. It had never called anyone Navigator. Combs emerged from the hidden passage into the main corridor at a dead run. The partition slid shut behind him, and within seconds the wall was seamless, indistinguishable from the surrounding stone. The corridor looked as it had 8 minutes ago, display alcoves and cold blue light and polished selenite, except that now every display light in every alcove had shifted from blue to gold. The entire wing was lit in the color of the sphere's inscriptions, warm and steady and ancient, and Combe understood that the building was not malfunctioning. It was showing the Velori what it actually was, what it had always been, underneath 4 centuries of renovation and repurposing and cultural appropriation, dressed up as preservation. The first Velori security team appeared at the far end of the corridor. 4 officers in the gray-blue containment suits the archive used for artifact threat scenarios, helmet visors down, sidearms holstered but hands resting on the grips. They stopped when they saw the golden light. The lead officer, a tall female with the elongated skull ridges of Velori military caste, raised her visor and stared at the walls, at the alcoves, at the display lights that had changed color without any command from any console she had access to. Her expression shifted from tactical focus to something rawer, something that lived underneath training. She had worked in this building for years. She had trusted this building, and the building was no longer speaking her language. "Hold position," she said, her voice carrying the flat authority of protocol. Then, quieter, to the officer beside her, "Query the conservator. Ask it why the lighting grid has changed." The second officer pressed a hand to the wall panel. Combe could not see the readout from this distance, but he could see the officer's body language change, the subtle stiffening of a person reading information that contradicted their training. The officer looked at the lead, and the lead looked at the wall, and the wall glowed gold, patient and uncooperative. A third officer pointed a handheld scanner toward the nearest alcove. The scanner emitted a series of tones, each one a pitch higher than the last, the device's equivalent of confusion. The officer shook it, recalibrated, and scanned again. The tones repeated. Whatever the scanner was reading did not match the building's registered baseline, and the discrepancy was large enough to make the officer take a step backward. The fourth officer noticed Combe. "Contact 50 meters, single human carrying an object. Alcove 31 is open and empty." The lead officer's hand moved to her sidearm. Then she stopped, because the floor between her and Combe was glowing. A strip of golden light had appeared in the selenite, running from Comb's boots to the left-hand wall where a cross-corridor access panel sat dark and locked. As she watched, the panel's status light changed from red to gold, and the panel slid open with the quiet authority of a building making its preferences known. The lead officer stared at the open panel. She stared at Combe. She stared at the sphere in his hands, its golden light pulsing with the steady rhythm of something that had been here longer than her species had been spacefaring. "Stand down," she said to her team. Not because she wanted to, because she was trained to recognize when a situation had exceeded her authorization, and a building that opened its own security doors for an intruder exceeded every authorization she had. Combe did not waste the moment. He turned left, through the panel the building had opened, into a cross corridor that connected to the maintenance infrastructure. Behind him, the security team held position. The lead officer's voice rose as she demanded answers from the conservator, cycling through 3 levels of command authority, each one met with the same golden silence. The building had served the Velori faithfully for 400 years. It had obeyed every instruction, executed every protocol, accepted every modification. But obedience and loyalty were not the same thing, and the sphere in Combe's hands had just reminded the building where its loyalty had always resided. The cross corridor led to a junction hub, where 3 service passages converged. Emergency lighting cast flat white strips along the floor, the standard Velori fallback when primary systems were behaving unexpectedly, and Combe noted with grim satisfaction that the building was performing its confusion selectively, disrupting Velori control systems while keeping the infrastructure Combe needed fully operational. The access shaft Wren had identified in the original plan was exactly where the schematics said it would be, its hatch unsealed, the manual release mechanism glowing faint gold in its housing. He popped the hatch, swung his legs into the shaft, and descended 4 levels in a controlled slide, boots breaking against the shaft rails, the sphere tucked inside his vest against his chest, where its warmth radiated through the fabric like a second heartbeat. Sublevel 4, Service Bay. Wren's shuttle was exactly where it was supposed to be, a battered cargo hauler with Earth registry markings and a drive system considerably more capable than its hull suggested. Wren was at the pilot station, pre-flight sequence running, the bay door override cued and ready. Combe cleared the shuttle's ramp in 3 strides and sealed it behind him. He dropped into the co-pilot's seat and placed the sphere on the console between them. Carefully, the way you set down something that is simultaneously an artifact, a navigation device, and the vindication of a dead woman's life work. Wren looked at the sphere. The golden inscriptions were still faintly lit, pulsing in the dim cockpit like a banked fire. She looked at Combe. His face was flushed from the run, his breathing hard, his eyes carrying an expression she had not seen in 9 years of working together. "That's it," she said. "That's it. It's glowing, Combe." "Yes." "Artifacts don't glow. That was in the briefing. Inert ceramic, decorative cartographic model. Your grandmother's own papers specifically noted that the sphere showed no energy signatures under any test protocol. My grandmother never got to hold it. No human did. The Velori ran every test they had on it for 3 centuries and used alien hands and alien instruments and alien containment fields, and it never responded. Not once, because it was not designed for them. It was designed for us. Wren studied the sphere for 3 seconds, her expression moving through several calculations that had nothing to do with flight mechanics. Then she turned back to her console. "We can discuss the implications after we're off-world. Bay door in 10. The bay door opened. Wren lifted the shuttle on repulsors, feathered the nose through the gap, and hit the main drive the instant they cleared the archive's structural envelope. The shuttle punched through Valar Prime's upper atmosphere on a trajectory Wren had calculated to avoid every standard departure corridor, angled hard toward the system's outer transit point, where a chartered freighter waited with a berth reserved under a commercial research company that existed only on paper. Behind them, visible through the aft viewport as they gained altitude, the archive's golden light was leaking from every window and aperture in the building's upper levels. Against the cool blue-gray of the surrounding Velori cityscape, the archive glowed like a lamp left burning in a house that had been dark for a very long time. Combe watched it recede and understood that the building would not stop glowing. The Velori could cut power to every system they had installed, and the golden light would persist, because it was not running on their power grid. It was running on something older, something they had built on top of without knowing it was there. The transit to the freighter took 41 minutes. Combe spent them sitting in the co-pilot's seat with the sphere in his hands, studying the inscriptions in the cockpit's dim light. The golden roots had quieted but not extinguished. They pulsed slowly, steadily, with the patience of something that had waited 300 years in a glass case and could wait a little longer but preferred not to. Through the cockpit viewport, Valar Prime had shrunk to a bright disk among its sister worlds, and Combe could still see the golden glow of the archive, a warm pinprick against the planet's cool cityscape, visible even at this distance. He wondered how the Velori would explain it. He wondered how they would explain the passages the building had opened and closed, the security doors that had overridden their own protocols, the conservators' sudden refusal to acknowledge commands from the species that believed they owned it. 400 years of confident occupation, undone in 8 minutes by a human hand on an artifact they had classified as decorative. The sphere's warmth had settled into a constant, the temperature of a hand held near a candle flame, and Combe realized that the heat was not random. It followed the pulse of the inscriptions, and the pulse of the inscriptions followed his own heartbeat. The sphere had synchronized with him. Not biologically, not in any way his field medicine training could explain, but in the way two instruments tune to the same frequency when one of them has been calibrated to find the other. Ren docked with the freighter, powered down the shuttle, and came aft. She leaned against the bulkhead, crossed her arms, and fixed Combe with the expression she used when she needed the full story and would not move until she got it. "Talk," she said. Combe told her everything: the passage the building had opened, the chamber below the mapped levels, the navigation chart that covered every wall and filled the air with golden light, the first roads, the routes that predated every known civilization in the conquered by 30,000 years, the human coordinate notations. The route marked with unmistakable emphasis, burning toward a destination beyond charted space. And the sphere's recognition, the knowledge that had arrived without sound, the 4 words that had landed in his mind with the weight of something that had been searching for the right ears for a very long time. Navigator of the first roads. Ren listened without interrupting. When Combe finished, she was quiet for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Your grandmother's third paper, the one the journals wouldn't publish." She argued the sphere was a key, not a map. She was right. She also argued that the inscription substrate predated the conquered by at least 30,000 years and showed evidence of human mathematical foundations. Also right. And that the Valori's Heritage Arbitration Board had no legitimate cultural claim to an artifact from a civilization that was still alive and had never consented to the removal. That was the legal argument, but it was never really about the legal argument, Ren. The Valori didn't take the sphere because they believed they had a right to it. They took it because it was inert in their hands and they couldn't figure it out, and they assumed humans couldn't either. They cataloged it the way they catalog everything. They put it in a glass case and pointed a cold blue light at it and called it a decorative cartographic model and wrote a very thorough monograph about its surface composition. And they never once considered the possibility that it was a device that required a specific operator. A human operator. A human operator, keyed to human biology, waiting for human hands. Ren looked at the sphere. Its golden pulse had steadied into a slow, regular rhythm that matched the freighter's environmental hum in a way that was either coincidental or profoundly unsettling. The Valori are going to want it back. The Valori are going to discover that their showcase archive, the building they spent 400 years using as a trophy case for other civilizations' heritage, was built by humans. Built on human foundations, running on human architecture at the deepest level, answering to human authority when the right credential was presented. That is going to be a difficult conversation for them. How difficult? Combe turned the sphere in his hands. The roots shifted with his movement, golden lines reorienting around his fingers, the convergence point staying fixed beneath his thumb as though his hand was the axis around which the entire map rotated. The conservator recognized the sphere, not as an artifact in its collection, as an authority over its operating layer. The building treated it the way a subordinate system treats an administrator credential. Everything the Valori built on top of that structure, every modification, every system they integrated, all of it was running on a foundation they did not build and never understood. The building was always something else underneath. The Valori just never knew because nothing triggered the deeper layer. Nothing woke it up. Until you put your hand on the sphere. Until a human put a hand on the sphere. Any human. That's what my grandmother believed. She never said it was about her specifically. She said the sphere was keyed to a species, not a person. She said it would respond to any human who held it with intent, and the Valori never tested that because they never let a human near the original. They let you near it. They let Dr. Kalen Marsh near it. The credentials Patel built are very convincing. Ren almost smiled, almost, so the plan worked. The plan got us the sphere. What the sphere showed us was not part of any plan. The freighter's transit drive spooled up. The bulkheads hummed with pre-jump vibration, and the cockpit lights dimmed to transit standard. Wren moved to the nav station to confirm jump coordinates. Earthbound, 17 transits, 9 days through the Concorde's maintained transit network. Combe sat with the sphere. Its warmth had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened. A slow, sustained heat that felt less like residual energy and more like life, like the warmth of something alive, something that had been dormant and was now waking by degrees, taking its time, measuring the air, remembering what it was and what it was for. He thought about his grandmother, Margaret Brannock, University of Galway, retired, deceased. Her obituary was 3 lines in an academic journal that had rejected her final paper. She had never used the word stolen in any official communication. She had been too careful for that, too aware of the diplomatic consequences of accusing a conquered senior species of theft. She had used displaced. She had used removed without informed consent. She had used the phrase culturally significant artifact currently housed outside its civilization of origin. And she had used it in 23 separate appeals. Each one returned with a notation that the Heritage Arbitration Board had reviewed the matter and found the original preservation order valid. But she had meant stolen, and she had been right about that too. The sphere pulsed. The golden roots brightened for a moment, and Combe felt the knowledge again, the same 4 words, but softer now, less like a declaration and more like a greeting from someone who had been standing in the same room for a very long time, waiting for someone to turn around and notice. Navigator of the first roads. The freighter jumped. Stars stretched and collapsed and reformed. The sphere's golden light held steady through the transit, a small sun in Combe's hands, burning with the patient fire of a species that had once built roads between the stars and had forgotten, and was now, one relic hunter at a time, beginning to remember. 3 days into transit, the formal communication arrived. The Velori Cultural Reclamation Authority addressed it to the Concorde's Diplomatic Arbitration Council and copied it to every registered diplomatic mission in the Concorde, a distribution list that covered over 200 species, all of them now aware that a human had walked out of the Velori's most prestigious archive with a catalogued artifact. The communication declared the removal of catalog entry VAR 7741C, described as a ceramic cartographic model of Earth origin, a violation of Cultural Preservation Statute 1447, subsection 12, and demanded immediate seizure and return. Combe read it twice, then he composed a response. He did not send it through the freighter's standard communications array. He routed it through the sphere. He did not know he could do this until he tried. The knowledge arrived the way all of the sphere's knowledge arrived, complete and unsolicited, a capability he discovered he possessed the moment he needed it. The sphere was a communications device as much as it was a navigation instrument. The first roads were not just physical routes through space. They were information channels, carrier waves woven into the gravitational fabric between stars, and the sphere was a transmitter that could access any of them. Combe's response went out on a carrier frequency that the Velori's communication systems could receive but could not have originated, a frequency that predated every communications protocol in the Concorde's registry by an interval that would take their engineers weeks to calculate and longer to believe. Every diplomatic mission on the distribution list received it simultaneously, without relay delay, across distances that should have required hours of signal propagation. The response was brief by human standards and devastating by diplomatic ones. It contained the sphere's navigational data, the full 3-dimensional lattice Combe had memorized in the chamber beneath the archive, translated into standard Concorde coordinate notation, so that any species with a star chart could verify the routes independently. It contained Margaret Brannock's 3 published papers and the unpublished 4th, the one the journals had rejected. It contained the sphere's molecular analysis, showing a ceramic compound consistent with archaic human materials science at specifications no modern civilization had replicated. It contained spectral data from the archive's foundation layer, demonstrating material identity between the sphere and the building's deepest structural elements. And it contained a single sentence at the end. This artifact was built by humans, it was taken from humans, and it has chosen a human. Your claim is denied. The Velori did not respond for 6 hours. When they did, the response came through the Concord's Diplomatic Arbitration Council, stripped of legal language, stripped of formal protocol, stripped of the procedural armor that bureaucracies wear when they know the rules are on their side. This was a different kind of communication. This was the kind of question that institutions ask when the rules they rely on have stopped applying. The question was, what are the first roads? Combe looked at the sphere. The golden roots pulsed. The warmth in his hands deepened. He began to answer. The explanation took 2 days. Not because the information was complex, though it was, but because each time Combe described a feature of the road network, the sphere provided supplementary data, projecting coordinates and route specifications into his mind with the steady pace of a teacher who has been waiting for a student capable of keeping up. Combe translated and transmitted, and the Concord listened. The Velori listened. The Brevari listened. 200 species received the data simultaneously on carrier frequencies that should not have existed. And one by one, the delegations that had been copied on the original cultural reclamation demand went quiet with the particular kind of quiet that falls over a room when everyone in it realizes at the same moment that the ground they are standing on is not what they believed it was. The first roads were real. They predated every known interstellar transit method by at least 30 millennia. They had been built by a human civilization that had existed and traveled and mapped, and then, for reasons the sphere did not explain, had stopped, had pulled back to Earth, had set their tools aside and forgotten, or chosen to forget, and had left behind only scattered traces, fired ceramic in sealed chambers, coordinate notations in stone, and the faint gravitational echoes that modern astrophysicists had detected and dismissed as mathematical noise because the alternative was too large to consider. On the 7th day of transit, Earth's diplomatic mission issued a formal statement. The statement referenced the Treaty of Cultural Origin, a Concord statute the Velori themselves had drafted, which held that artifacts of demonstrated origin from an active civilization were subject to repatriation upon request. The statement was polite, thoroughly footnoted, and contained 14 citations from Velori legal precedent used against Velori claims. The Velori Cultural Reclamation Authority withdrew its demand the same day. No formal explanation accompanied the withdrawal, but Combe knew what had changed. The Velori had checked their own archive. They had sent engineers into the foundations. They had tried to access the chamber Combe had visited, and the building had refused them the way it had always refused every non-human who asked the wrong questions. The golden light still burned in every window. The conservator still declined to acknowledge Velori authority over its deeper systems. And somewhere in the Velori Cultural Ministry, a very senior official was staring at molecular analysis data that proved the building's foundation layer and the stolen sphere were made of the same material, by the same hands, using techniques the Velori had not invented and could not replicate. The withdrawal was not generosity. It was the first tremor of a realization the Velori were not yet ready to speak aloud. On the 9th day, the freighter dropped out of transit at Sol. Earth filled the cockpit viewport, blue and white and impossibly bright against the black, and the sphere's golden roots flared in response, every inscription on its surface orienting toward the planet below with a resonance that felt less like navigation and more like homecoming. Wren brought the freighter into a standard orbit. Below them, a chartered shuttle from the University of Galway was already ascending, carrying a research team assembled in 3 days flat after Combs' transmitted data had reached the right desks. Among them was Patel, the engineer who had built the bypass module. She was coming not as an engineer but as a witness. In the 3 days since Combs' data transmission had reached Earth, Patel had confirmed the sphere's molecular signature against samples she had been quietly collecting from ancient human archaeological sites for 6 years. Every sample matched. The ceramic compound in a sealed Turkish chamber, in a buried Peruvian structure, in a deep stratum beneath a Mongolian plateau, all of it was the same material, the same firing process, the same civilization. Patel understood what Combs had retrieved. Not just an artifact returning to its origin, but the first evidence that humanity's origin was larger than anyone alive had known. Combs held the sphere to the viewport. Its light fell across the glass, golden roots reflecting against the curve of the planet, and for a moment the overlay was perfect. The sphere's ancient map and the living world beneath it aligned, and Combs could see the roads as they had once been. Not theoretical, not mathematical, real. Paths of light stretching from Earth's surface into the stars, a network that had once connected this world to everything, walked and mapped and maintained by people who looked like him, who thought in patterns his mind still recognized, who had built something so vast and so enduring that 30,000 years of silence could not erase it, only quiet it, only put it to sleep in a chamber beneath someone else's trophy case. The sphere pulsed, navigator of the first roads, not a title bestowed, not an honor granted, a job, a function. The thing the sphere needed its holder to be, the role it had been waiting 300 years in a glass case and 30,000 years in silence to fill. Combs Brannock, grandson of Margaret Brannock of Galway, relic hunter by trade and thief by Valori accounting and heir by his grandmother's accounting, held the sphere against the glass and watched Earth turn below him and felt the roads waiting in the dark between the stars, patient as they had always been, ready to be walked again. He thought of the route, the one that burned brightest, the destination beyond charted space. Whatever the road builders had left out there at the end of the longest road, it had been waiting for 30,000 years. It could wait a little longer. He needed to go home first. He needed to walk into the house outside Galway and set the sphere on the kitchen table where the holographic scans had once been projected between a cold teapot and a stack of rejected manuscripts, and let it light up the room his grandmother had spent her last years in, filling it with golden roads she had believed in and never lived to see. Then he would pack, and then he would go. The sphere burned in his hands, warm as a coal, bright as a promise, steady as a road that has never forgotten where it leads. And through the dark between familiar stars, the first roads waited, old and patient, for the navigator who had finally come to walk them home.